Should be going. Okay, awesome. Thanks for reading that for us. It's a great passage. So I want you to think about a time where you've asked someone to explain something to you. It's something that you should probably be able to understand, something that should be pretty easy to comprehend. I remember when Thomas and I were doing our pre-marriage counselling with Roshan and Lottie, for some reason the internet came up. And I can't remember why. It was probably on one of those random tangents that we had that wasn't really anything to do with marriage or pre-marriage or anything. We were just talking about random things. And somehow it became apparent that neither Thomas nor I knew how the internet worked. We know how to use the internet, but we didn't know how the internet worked. And Roshan seemed pretty surprised that we didn't know how the internet worked. And so I thought, oh, well, given that he seems so surprised, maybe this should be common knowledge. Maybe it's quite easy to understand. So I said, can you explain? How does the internet work? And I got an explanation. There were lots of words. The words themselves made sense. I knew what the words were, but put them in a sentence. And the sentences also made sense. But if I had to try to re-explain it to someone, I just didn't get it. I'd kind of got it, but I didn't fully get it. And it was a bit like when I used to ask my brother Braden how to explain a maths question to me, or if I asked Thomas to explain something about politics or economics. And they do their best to explain it well, and I understand the words, but I didn't get what it meant. And I'm sure that I'm not the only person here, and I know that for a fact that I'm not the only person in history who's experienced that feeling. And the Gospels are full of people who get it, but don't fully get it. In John's Gospel especially, there's all of these ideas of night and day, darkness and light, blindness and sight. And last week, Catherine shared about Nicodemus, who had come to Jesus in the darkness of night, and he didn't fully get who Jesus was. And then in next week, Catherine's brother Bryce is going to be sharing about the Samaritan woman who came to Jesus in the light of day and who came away from that encounter knowing something of who Jesus was, even if not fully. And here in chapter 11, when Jesus encounters the two sisters of Lazarus, we see that they kind of see who Jesus is, but they don't fully see. They get it, but not completely. And still, Jesus meets each of Mary and Martha where they're at. He doesn't critique them for their lack of understanding. He doesn't tell them off for not fully getting who he is and how he acts. He meets them where they're at, and he is in there with them in their grief. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I asked Thomas the other day, I asked him what he thinks about when he thinks of the story of Lazarus and his sisters. And he said three things. The first one I was a bit confused about, but anyway, we won't dwell on it. He said Martha is the more correct. He said Jesus wept. And the third thing, which I thought was quite funny, was Lazarus seems to have a transformative encounter with Jesus insofar as he becomes undead. And I thought that was quite good. And those are three things that Thomas thought about when he thought about the story of Lazarus. And I wonder about what you think of when you think about this story. For many people, it's all about the fact that Lazarus is raised from death. And that is a massive focus, and it's a huge sign that John is talking about in the Gospel of John, that John is talking about when he's talking about Jesus in his Gospel. A resurrection does not happen every day, so that's a good thing to focus on. For other people, the biggest thing is that Jesus wept, that he identified with our humanity, and he experienced the reality of our grief as we struggle to know hope. And again, that's a huge thing that we're going to come back to. But an aspect of this story that sometimes we don't think about heaps are those conversations and the encounters that Jesus had with Martha and Mary themselves, the sisters of Lazarus, the ones who were left in that space of grief and confusion when he became sick and died. And so we're going to look at Martha and her response to Jesus, Mary and her response to Jesus, and the way that Jesus meets each of them differently. He understands that they don't fully get it, but he loves them and continues to walk with them where they are. And so we start off this story in Bethany, a village that's about 3 kilometers from Jerusalem. And that's about the same as from here down to Pack and Save and back again, or it's about the same as from my house to my work. It's pretty close, these two places. And so in this village of Bethany is where Lazarus, a dearly beloved friend of Jesus, and Mary and Martha live. And Lazarus is very sick. And Mary and Martha and Lazarus and all of the Jews around him have seen what Jesus has done for other people. He's seen that he's healed sickness, he's given sight to the blind, he's fed thousands. And Mary and Martha know that Jesus has the power to heal. And so in great faith, they send out this message to Jesus, telling him that the one you love is sick. And I imagine that they must have been hoping beyond hope that Jesus would drop everything and come to Lazarus and make him well. But he doesn't. In verse 5 of chapter 11, John writes, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days, and then he said to his disciples, 'Let's go back to Judea.'" Jesus loves them, but he doesn't go back to them immediately. And he doesn't heal Lazarus from a distance like he has done before with the Roman official's son. It's really a bit strange. Why would Jesus not go immediately or heal him right then and there? And there's clearly, for Jesus, there is this greater purpose in this whole occasion. As Jesus says in verse 4, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that the God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus is holding that bigger picture, and even though his disciples, including Martha and Mary, could not understand, Jesus knew that this encounter was going to be important for them so that they might believe. So Jesus knew that Lazarus had died, and when he arrived in Bethany, a lot of Jews had already come from Jerusalem. They'd come from just up the road, and they'd come to comfort Mary and Martha in the loss of their brother. The Jewish custom back then was for people who were grieving to stay in the house and for the guests to come and sit in silence. And occasionally they'd join in with tears and mourning themselves. And for a lot of us here in New Zealand, Western culture, if someone dies, that's quite a foreign idea. Like, often people will die and they'll be taken to the funeral home, and then you'll wait a couple of days and you'll have the funeral, and then it's all done. And there's none of this kind of sitting with and mourning as a community in our everyday practice. But this Jewish custom is actually quite similar to many other cultures around the world. Recently, my Filipino auntie lost her brother, and she and my uncle went to the Philippines for the funeral. And it was an intensely long grieving process, similar to Martha and Mary and Lazarus. The parents, the wife, and the siblings in mourning, they stayed at home with the body, and the guests would come and they'd support through their own tears and grief. These cultures understand that lament is practiced in community. It isn't something that we should have to go through on our own. But even so, it is a hugely exhausting and emotional time. And it was this situation that Mary and Martha were in as Jesus was approaching the village. They're at home and they're grieving because Lazarus has already been in the tomb for 4 days. The Jews believed that the spirit of a person stayed around the body for 3 days after death, and then it departed. So by the 4th day, it really is, there's no more hope for them in the sense of the possibility of anything happening. And so Martha and Mary are in that space of realizing the grief that their brother had died, that they would no longer see him in this life. There would have been so many emotions: heartbreak, sorrow, confusion, Why hadn't Jesus come? Disappointment? Why had he not done anything when he loved Lazarus? The grief of what had been lost and what they would no longer experience with their brother. And Martha and Mary are in the house, and they hear that Jesus is coming. And Martha, instead of staying in the house as was custom, she went out and she went to meet Jesus, while Mary stayed seated and sensitive and reflective. In the Gospel of Luke, you might be familiar with the story of Martha and Mary in chapter 10, where Martha opens up her home to Jesus and his disciples, and she serves him as he teaches his disciples. And in this story, Mary is at Jesus' feet, listening to him speaking, while Martha is busy making preparations for the meal. And this story gives us a little bit of insight into the two personalities of these sisters. No two sisters are the same, and though they'll of course have similarities in background and upbringing, there are differences. My sister Lauren and I are vastly different from each other in many, many ways, even though we share some things in common. Lauren is by nature more reflective. She's more attuned to her emotions. She's more likely to do something completely random and crazy. She's far more likely to burst into song and dance like a chicken than I am. I, on the other hand, am by nature more task-focused. I'm more likely to kind of get into jobs mode and just focus on what's in front of me. I'm more likely to just say yes to lots of things to be helpful, sometimes to the point of overcommitting. And none of these differences are bad. It's not to say that one is more right than the other. It's not bad that I'm not as reflective as Lauren, and it's not bad that she is not as prone to overcommitting to things as I am. And I say this because sometimes in the case of Mary and Martha, the stories can be told as though one person's response is better than the other's. And sometimes we can give one or the other of them a bad rap. And I think that that's really unhelpful when we're thinking about characters in the Gospels and what they have to teach us. They're teaching us different things. Martha and Mary are different. Martha is the more activistic organizer type. She's busy, she's generous in her hospitality as she's opening up her home to Jesus in both Luke 10 and then again in John chapter 12. She's using her gifts of service to provide a space and meals that allow other people to interact with Jesus. But she can also be distracted. She can be worried and stressed about things. She can focus so much on the tasks that she forgets who she is serving. Mary, on the other hand, is often described as more sensitive. In Luke chapter 10, she's busy listening at Jesus' feet. And here in John 11, she's staying at home grieving. And then when she comes to Jesus, she weeps. In John chapter 12, just after this story, Mary comes to Jesus, and while Martha is hosting, Mary comes and anoints Jesus' feet with oil and wipes it with her hair. So these two sisters are different, and the way that Jesus meets them is different. When Martha goes out to Jesus, she's grieving and she's longing to see Jesus, her Lord and her teacher. And she says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And I wonder what way these words were said. Were they an accusation? Were they filled with hurt? Were they just grief? Were they disappointment? Things could have been different. Was she angry at Jesus? Alongside any hurt or confusion that Martha had, she definitely had confidence. Martha knew that Jesus was who he said he was. She knew that Jesus had this healing power and that he could have done something. And she shows this confidence when she says, "But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask." She knows that Jesus can understand her pain and that he would be able to give her confidence about Lazarus' future hope. And so this whole conversation ends up playing out, where Jesus says to Martha, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha says, "I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day." She's so calm and measured and practical and pragmatic. She's in grief, but her grieving seems to be surrounded by this kind of intellectual thinking about how it actually works out. She's trying to fit in how what Jesus is saying fits into her worldview and how she understands things. It's quite amazing to me that she was able to have this full conversation with Jesus, despite the grief that she would have been feeling. And the conversation continues, and Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" Jesus has just made a huge statement, one of the 7 great I am statements in the Gospel of John. He's saying that he has the power of resurrection for those who believe, but even more than that, Jesus is saying that he is life itself. Jesus' power could reach beyond the grave, and even though Lazarus had been dead for 4 days, and his spirit was thought to be in the place of the dead, that did not limit what Jesus could do. And Jesus says to Martha, "Do you believe this?" And Martha says, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." And if we pause here for a second and think about what Martha has just said, she has just given one of the most complete statements about who Jesus is in the whole gospel. She knows that he is the Messiah, that he is the Son of God, and that he is the promised one that the Jews had been expecting. But even though she says this statement, she says these words, she kind of gets it, but she doesn't fully get it. And we can see that because when Jesus goes to the tomb of Lazarus and Martha is there, if Martha had fully understood that Jesus meant that he would overcome the power of death and bring resurrection and life now, she would have stepped back and said nothing. But instead, she jumps in and says, "But Lord, there's a bad odor now. He's been dead for 4 days." She's understood in part, but not in full. And Jesus responds, reminding her of the very thing that he had said earlier, that if you believe, you will see the glory of God. And then that miracle where Jesus raises Lazarus from death and he walks out in his wrappings, the cloth over his face, which must have been both terrifying and exhilarating, joyous and overwhelming. But what I find fascinating is that after John has focused so much on Jesus' interaction with Martha and Mary, there's nothing about their reactions to the actual miracle itself. I wonder what Martha and Mary actually thought. How did they understand what had just happened? Did Martha click that this is what Jesus had been talking about? Did she more fully understand who Jesus is? But we aren't told. John is almost intentionally focusing our attention on how Jesus was with Martha and Mary in their confusion and their grief, rather than in the celebratory moment itself. And that surely has something to say to us, that with Jesus, he isn't so concerned that we understand everything perfectly, and that we get it all instantly, but rather that he meets us where we're at, and he sits with us and helps us to grow from that place, and teaches us along the way. And how he does that differently for each person. So we'll turn to Mary and how Jesus interacted with her in her sorrow. After Martha had her conversation with Jesus, she went back to Mary at the house and told her that the teacher was here, that Jesus was here and asking for her. And even though Mary hadn't initially gone out to meet with Jesus, She hadn't been proactive in that. She is really responsive. And when he calls her, she listens and immediately moves. She gets up quickly and leaves and doesn't explain to anybody who's mourning with her what she's doing. She just gets up and goes. And so they all assume that she's probably heading to the tomb to mourn there, maybe for a change of scenery. And so they follow after her in the hopes that they can continue to be her community and grieve with her. But instead of going to the tomb, we see Mary reach Jesus and fall at his feet, saying, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The exact same words as Martha. "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." Again, there's this sense of hurt and confusion mingled with the confidence that Jesus is powerful to save, and yet he had not. He hadn't done anything for Lazarus, and now their whole community was in grief. And while Jesus had known that Martha could have a conversation, here Mary ends up just in tears. Each of these women were grieving, but they were grieving differently. And Jesus responded to them differently. John says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. Jesus knew what was going to happen. Right from the start, he had known that he was going to raise Lazarus from the death, as a sign of demonstrating who he is as the great I am, the resurrection and the life. But still, in seeing his friends weeping and wrestling with their own grief, Jesus grieved. He was deeply moved in spirit. He didn't just feel these emotions as a surface level sadness or sympathy. Jesus deeply grieved in himself. Even though he knew that there was hope literally right around the corner, he still sat with his friends in their grief, and he grieved as well. And I think there's a few reasons that Jesus wept. And though some people will argue that it was entirely one reason or entirely another, I think it's probably a combination. We as humans are complex creatures, and we have a whole bunch of different things that play into our responses. And so I think that Jesus was probably upset at the disciples' misunderstanding and upset at the reality of death in this world. He had come to overcome death, and this was something that was in the way of the people that he loved flourishing. And so to see that reality of death affecting people moved him to grief. Lazarus was Jesus' dear friend, the one that he loved. He'd spent time with him many times before, and he does again after this story. And he would have been deeply grieved that Lazarus had died. Jesus showed that even though there is hope for the future, he shows that mourning in the present is good and right as a response to the reality of loss and death. And it reminds me of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13 and 14, where it talks about us grieving. We're not called to grieve as those who have no hope. And sometimes when we talk about these verses, they can kind of be brushed over and kind of like a little patch on our wounds to try to make us feel a bit better. But here Jesus is showing that actually these verses have so much truth that he knew that there was hope, and he grieved, and we are able to grieve and grieve with tears, not just kind of surface sadness. And the third reason I think that Jesus wept is that he was mourning with those who mourn. He was not only experiencing his own grief, but the grief of his friends, and he was coming alongside them, showing them that they were not alone in their sorrow. And I'm sure many of you can think of examples where you have experienced that comfort of someone else coming alongside and grieving with and for you, even when they could see the hope and they could see that the grief would not last forever. They come alongside and grieve with you, and that is a significant moment. I remember when I was a teenager and I was struggling with my mental health, I'd lie in bed at night and tried to go to sleep, and I'd be in tears, thinking that this pain and this anxiety and hopelessness would never end. It felt like no one cared. It felt like I was completely alone in my grief. Sorry, I can't see. I felt like I would never get better and that there was no hope. And I remember my mum and dad coming into my room, and they would sit with me and they would cry with me. They didn't try to fix it. They didn't try to explain away my sadness. They didn't ignore me and let me go through it on my own. They sat with me and they grieved with me. They were the hands and feet of Jesus. That is what I needed, and that was what Mary needed in her moment. As she grieved, as her community grieved, Jesus wept with and for them. Jesus met Martha with words, and he met Mary with tears. And he meets us as we need. In the grief that these two sisters were facing, Jesus was there. And even though they didn't fully understand who he was, they didn't fully understand the truth that he'd been teaching them, Jesus was with them. And he didn't critique their lack of understanding. He didn't critique the grief that they were feeling. He didn't tell them to pull themselves together and get over it. And he didn't rush from the grief to the resurrection. He continued to love them and walk with them, even in their misunderstandings. Mary and Martha had seen Jesus, but they didn't see him fully. They understood in part, but not in full. And we are the same. In 1 Corinthians 13, Paul writes, "For we know in part and prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. Now we know in part, but then we shall know fully, even as we have been fully known." Martha and Mary knew in part. I know in part who Jesus is. You each know in part who Jesus is. And he's gifted you with different knowledge and understanding of him at different times in your lives. And I think that is an immense encouragement to us, that as we walk with Jesus, he meets us where we are, and we come to know him more. Jesus doesn't critique each of us for not fully understanding who he is. He doesn't reject us when we make mistakes, but he comes alongside us and he teaches us more about who he is. He meets us where we are at. Right now, we do not know fully, but then when we are face to face with Jesus, we will know fully who he is, even as we are fully known. So I'm going to pray before Thomas comes up to lead into communion. Lord, thank you that you are the one who knows us intimately, and you see each of us in the different situations that we find ourselves in. Thank you for this reminder of Jesus encountering Martha and Mary and the ways that he met each of these women differently in their grief. He met Martha as she wrestled through ideas of who he was intellectually. And he met Mary in the emotional experience that she was feeling. Jesus, thank you that you grieved with each of these women and that you grieve with us as well. Thank you that you did not explain away the pain, that you did not minimize their suffering, even though you knew that there was hope. And Jesus, thank you for this reminder that though we do not know or see you fully, we can come to see you more clearly each day. Thank you that even though Martha and Mary knew you and were your disciples, that you weren't upset at them when they didn't fully grasp your power over death and the grave. Thank you that we can have confidence that you will help each of us as we continue to learn more of you and grow in our relationships with you. We pray that you would reveal more of yourself. And we look forward to the day, Lord, when we will see you face to face, when we will know you fully as we are fully known by you. In your precious name, amen.